Hello everyone and welcome to our video all about salt for babies. So recommendations for salt with infants are simple. Minimize added salt as much as possible. Now, why do we want to minimize added salt intake in babies? Well, kidneys are very, very important for fluid and electrolyte balance in the body, of which sodium is a key player. Now, for babies with their teeny tiny baby kidneys, they're still developing and still maturing, so a really high dietary salt load can be stressful on these vital organs. Now, I'm gonna give you some information about general salt recommendations in terms of numbers for infants, but I want you to keep something in mind. I generally never recommend that a parent track their child's salt intake unless there is a medical reason to do so. I think there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of fear-based information online saying how bad salt is for babies, or you should be avoiding all salt at all costs. And I think it's important that we really take a more scientific and balanced approach when we look at salt intake for babies. So I'm gonna give you this number, but you gotta promise that you're not gonna freak out and hyper-focus on it. Okay, so as far as official numbers go, the adequate intake for sodium in infants for ages 6 to 11 months is 370 milligrams per day. So a couple things to keep in mind about this number. Adequate intake here means goal intake. It does not mean maximum intake, which you often hear discussed for salt recommendations in adults. Now, this adequate intake also includes the sodium consumption from breast milk or formula. Now, if your baby is taking in formula, we can generally calculate how much sodium they're getting per day just by looking at the back of the can and reading the food label. But if your baby is drinking breast milk, their sodium intake is going to vary based on how much they're drinking per day, their age, and even based on the mother. So it's estimated that a baby might be consuming around 200 milligrams of sodium per day from breast milk, based on there being about 42 milligrams of sodium per 8 ounces of breast milk. But again, this number varies widely, so this is really an estimate. So this means that the rest of the sodium consumption for a baby will be coming from solid foods. Now, keep in mind, there's no official upper limit for sodium intake for infants ages 6 to 11 months. Now, the reason I mention this is that the sodium recommendations for adults are in terms of an upper limit, but the sodium recommendations for infants are in terms of a goal intake. So for adults, when we're talking about upper limits, this means the most that you should consume before experiencing negative health consequences. And even this is a really controversial area of research in the world of nutrition. But sodium recommendations for infants, again, are in terms of adequate intake or a goal. So we can't look at sodium recommendations for infants and adults through the same lenses. So back to practical sodium talk here. So does this mean that we should be avoiding all food with salt as an added ingredient? No. This means do what you can to substitute, prep, and adjust to avoid adding salt when cooking, and avoid giving baby lots of processed foods with high amounts of added salt. But this also means that it's really important to take into consideration the amount of food that we're giving baby here. So for example, store-bought hummus is often higher in sodium than homemade hummus. But if you are only spreading a half a teaspoon of hummus on a teething cracker, that's much different in terms of sodium content than if you're giving baby a whole serving or 1 tablespoon of hummus. So just because it's higher in added salt, you have to keep in mind the volume that you're giving baby. Because I just want to hammer this home here. There's a lot of extreme content online about avoiding all sodium and going to large lengths to cook separate everything for baby to avoid sodium. However, when it comes to salt, I recommend a more balanced and logical approach. So I'm gonna give you some food examples here. Now, let's talk about some foods that might have hidden salt, or foods that typically have higher amounts of salt when it comes to feeding your baby. So things like breads, pasta sauces, soy sauce or other stir-fry sauces, canned soup, cottage cheese or other cheeses, frozen meals, and fast food all generally have a higher amount of salt. Now, foods with a little bit higher of added salt, but not quite as high as the list I've mentioned here, are things like store-bought hummus and canned beans or veggies. Now, what can you do instead of each of these items to give baby a little bit lower amount of daily salt intake? So you can swap pasta sauce for plain canned tomato sauce. Now, keep in mind, plain canned tomato sauce can still have a lot of added sodium in it. So you want to look for a can that specifically says no salt added. And so that will just be a can of pureed tomatoes. I also recommend using low sodium soy sauce or coconut aminos in your family stir fry rather than a full sodium soy sauce. I also recommend avoiding serving canned soups altogether or making homemade soups. You can also, if you're going to serve a canned soup to your baby, you can try draining the broth and just serving baby all the good stuff, because the broth generally has most of the sodium in the soup. Choosing a lower sodium cottage cheese. Now, these are harder to find, but you can generally find them at your more specialty health food stores like Whole Foods or Sprouts, although sometimes you can find them at a general store like Target or Kroger. As far as fast food goes, generally avoiding fast food for your infant is going to be your best bet, but if you do choose to serve your baby fast food, choose the options with the highest nutrient density and the most veggies and fiber, and limit the frequency. So if you're going to serve your baby something that has a higher amount of salt, do what you can to make it work for your baby in other ways. Get lots of added iron and fiber and other vitamins and minerals in there as well. Read the labels. When it comes to choosing foods for your baby, read the labels, and especially for frozen meals, choose the frozen meals with the lowest sodium. Now, not all frozen meals are high in sodium. It just is going to is going to require you to do a little bit of extra digging to find those lower sodium option. For hummus, like I said, limit the amount that you serve your baby or make your own. This can simply look like a puree of garbanzo beans and olive oil in a small blender. You don't have to be a fancy chef to do these things. And then when it comes to canned beans, choose options with no added sodium and rinse them thoroughly before cooking. You should be doing this for all of your canned vegetables, looking for options with no added sodium and then rinsing as well, because oftentimes the liquid that they're canned in contains a fair amount of sodium. So I have an example for you here. So this is a can of black beans from Walmart, and the sodium per serving is 370 milligrams per serving. So that's in about half a cup. Whereas these canned black beans from Walmart, they say no salt added, and this has 10 milligrams of sodium per serving. So a lot less sodium in these canned beans than these, just because there's no salt added. So look for that label on the can. So moral of the story here, when it comes to sodium, minimize salt where you can, but don't stress if baby has a meal at grandparents' house with regular tomato sauce. Overall balance is the goal here.